screen so much, and I have to press this button to turn the slides. But once again, I'm Dr. Ayana Omilade Flewellen. I am a professor at Stanford University, and I'm also the president of the Society of Black Archaeologists and another organization called Diving with a Purpose, both of which I'm going to share more about. But a little bit about me. I like to call myself a Black feminist. Do you know what a feminist is? I saw you nod your head. What is it? Exactly, absolutely. So I'm a Black feminist, so I fight for Black women's rights at the center of the work that I do. And because I'm an archaeologist and I study the past, I do that with Black women specifically in the past, really trying to center on our stories and our histories. And I'm also an archaeologist, and we'll ask and talk more about that as well. But I also call myself a storyteller because as someone who's studying history, I'm creating the historical narratives that end up hopefully in our textbooks, right? At the National Park Service sites, in our museums, these other ways that like everyone gets to enjoy history beyond just in our classroom settings. And then I'm also an artist as well. And y'all are being taught by brilliant artists here at this school and really thinking about what it means to create in this world that is about who we are and who we envision ourselves to be. Do I need to speak up? Or I'm good? Okay. So, what is archaeology? Can anyone give me like a definition of archaeology? And there isn't a wrong answer. You can just shoot out some things like, what do you think it is? Who comes to mind when you think of an archaeologist? Yeah. The study of history through, yeah. It's, yes. So some of us are digging in the dirt from it. Some of us are also diving underwater and doing this. What are some other thoughts? I see you thinking. What you thinking? It's okay. Artifacts, so these objects, right, that people use in the past. And who comes to mind? Like when you think of an archaeologist as a person, who's the person that comes to mind? Describe a person for me. You think of a man, you think of a woman. It's okay. No thoughts? Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Other thoughts? I saw you about to talk, but you put your hand down. What were you gonna say? That's that's so true. So I think it's really important for us when we're thinking about the image of an archaeologist or when we're thinking about different professions, who are the people that come to mind, right? We think of historians or history and people who do that work. And why is it that a man is the first that comes to mind? Why can't other people do this work as well? Most of the kind of public persona of archaeology that we see in movies, I always do this with students and I'm like, has anyone heard of Indiana Jones? Really? Oh my gosh. Okay. For whatever reason, most people have been saying no. Who's Indiana Jones? I saw some head nods. No one's heard of him? Yeah. Indiana Jones, much like these other movies like Night at the Museum or The Mummy, Tomb Raider, National Treasure. Have y'all seen any of these movies? Mm-mm, I know. It's okay. You're not missing anything. But usually, these are the images that people get of an archaeologist, right? Oftentimes, it's men. Oftentimes, they're white men. Or in the case of Tomb Raider, they're white women. And oftentimes, what archaeologists are doing are busting through people's temples, right? Busting through people's homes and taking their stuff, right? And that oftentimes is the public image of an archaeologist. But I'm here to say that that's not what we do. It's not nearly anything around what we do. In fact, as an archaeologist, we do a lot of work within education, right? Public history. We're doing a lot of work in what's called CRM, so cultural resource management. We're doing museum work and work with the National Park Service. Has anyone been to the National Park Service sites down here on island? Yeah. Nice, nice, very nice. So with archaeology, and you can see us doing a bit of it, right? We said it's the study of history, it's the study through artifacts. So it's really thinking about the history of human experience through the material culture, right? And these are the objects that people used, right? So it's the chairs that you're sitting in, it's the beads that are attached to our hair, yes, that are so beautiful, right? It's the earrings that are in our ears, right? It's the schools, the churches, the supermarkets that we walk inside. And it's also how we change the environment around us, right? So, what do you think St. Croix I looked like before there were schools, before there were sugar plantations? What do you think this space looked like? Bush. Exactly. Bush, trees, rainforest, wildlife, right? And then humans, both indigenous at first, right? We got the Arawaks, we got the Tainos, and then you had European expansion that brought a lot of other people here as well, right? So we think about enslaved Africans that were brought here, right? We think about the freedom that we all fought for, one, and the way that we continue to live on this landscape and continue to change it, right? All of that leaves an archaeological footprint that I like to study, right? And some of the career choices, so we know we have the National Park Service. You can be something like me, a professor who teaches this in a variety of different contexts, if it's like at a university or at schools. Or you can also work in museums, right? You can work for the government, like the Department for Natural Resources, DPNR. Thank you. But some of the cooler jobs that my friends have, they're working as consultants for video games, right? Because they're working with the video gamers and video engineers to create historical landscapes that match history. And I think they got the best bet, fun, honestly. If I could just walk around doing games all day, I'd be set. So I like to share that there's a really rich history of Black people doing archaeology, right? And some of the earliest examples of that are George McJunkin, who was doing archaeological work in New Mexico in 1908. There's John Weasley Gilbert, who was doing archaeological work in Greece in the early, I want to say, 1890s. He was doing Greece. He was doing archaeology in Greece. And then some of my favorite examples are actually in the 1930s, where in the United States, there were whole crews of Black women who were excavating at Native American sites in Georgia. So we have a long history of being people who were not only just interested in our own history, right, but in larger world history as well, which of course we're also a part of. So because there aren't a lot of Black archaeologists, a friend of mine and I decided to start an organization that really centered on us having space in this field, right? I would go to a conference and I would find maybe 5 other people who looked like me doing this work out of like 2,000. And I was like, we got to get together and like have a space to be safe, and then also to create more space for folks who look like us, right? So when I was an undergrad in college, I started this organization called the Society of Black Archaeologists. And it's a group that essentially is a networking space for archaeologists of African descent and those who work at African diaspora sites, so sites that relate to the continent of Africa, and then the sites where all the folks like us in this room have traveled and traversed across the diaspora, right? And through SBA, we've really centered on a lot of programming that is about creating space for us in this field and documenting the history of Black folks in this field. So I was really fortunate in 2015 to be introduced to another amazing organization called Diving with a Purpose. And I know that some of the students from Ms. Lynch's class might have learned about Diving with a Purpose and the work that we're doing with searching for underwater slave ships. Am I getting that right? People are shaking their heads. Cool. So Diving with a Purpose is another nonprofit organization that has programming around oceanic conservation. So thinking about the ways in which we care for our oceans, and then also thinking about how we preserve our heritage underwater, right? So I love to show that there's DWP Cares that does all the work with coral reefs. Has anyone seen the coral reefs around St. Croix and gone snorkeling? Yeah? Yeah? Awesome. And then we also have our maritime archaeology program, and then our youth diving with a purpose program, which are training youth your age to dive and to do underwater survey work with us as we work on documenting these shipwrecks and other submerged resources. So Diving with a Purpose reached out in 2015. Well, I have a couple of other slides of us doing this really great work. So this is some of us doing work, doing coral restoration work. This is me working with Dr. Gail Fitzpatrick, who is in her 80s and still diving. And then, of course, you have us actually doing the underwater archaeology work, right? So what are some things that y'all learned, especially the students from Ms. Lynch's class, about the work that Diving with a Purpose is doing? Yeah? Hmm? You don't remember? Does anyone remember? I heard some of you shaking your head, or I saw some of you shake your head. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And coral restoration, as you mentioned, what's your name? John? Zion. As Zion mentioned, coral restoration work is so important in the Caribbean because it is your coral reefs that provide protection against the storm surge for hurricanes, for tsunamis, but also they provide the main source, the living source for all of your fisheries as well, right? So where you're getting all of your seafood comes from these spaces, right? And the necessity to have healthy coral reefs, healthy mangroves, right? To provide a sustainable source of food intake. So on the screen here, you see a couple of our Diving with a Purpose members who are doing documentation on a shipwreck project that was in Key Biscayne, Florida. And those students are students who are your age. They're high school students who are between the ages of 16 and 24 who are documenting this particular shipwreck, right? And they have these pin flags that they're putting down to mark where different objects are underwater. And then with a ruler and tape, they're laying that out. They're drawing it out there, and then they're measuring how far different objects are from a baseline. And at the end of that, they get a full map of a complete shipwreck that they're able to then use to document how it shifts and changes over time. So shifts and changes come in a variety of different ways and contexts, but most often what y'all would be more familiar with are hurricanes Irma and Maria that shifted a lot of sand around this island. So you had so many of your coral reefs, so many of your heritage sites that were covered and uncovered because of the kind of movements that happen with hurricanes. But Diving with the Purpose reached out to SBA because they were interested in starting a project here on St. Croix. And they were interested in starting a project on St. Croix because of the rich history that St. Croix has in regards to its colonial history and placement in the Caribbean Sea. Now, why would St. Croix be so important? What happened here in the 1800s, 1700s? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So thinking about the importance, the strategic location of St. Croix as a space in the Caribbean, when it was occupied by the Danish, it had open ports, right? Which meant that European colonies were coming and going from this space with relative ease. And the way that ocean currents, as you mentioned, it brings people naturally from across the Atlantic into these particular waters, right? So there's a way that St. Croix has a rich history as a mixing space and contact space for indigenous groups prior to Columbus, right? For the Spanish, for the English, for the Dutch and Danish, and the seven full flags that also have laid claim to this space. But then also for the very reason that so many of us are here, right? People from across the Caribbean call this space home as well. So DWP was like, this space has such a rich history, and there are so many wreck sites and history underneath the ground that we walk on every single day, but in the waters that surround St. Croix as well. So we're really interested in exploring what that can look like. Thank you. So in 2016, we started a new project. And it was a project that was doing terrestrial archaeology, so archaeology on land, and then underwater archaeology as well. And the main goal for the project was really to train students to do archaeological work. And we really centered this project on really thinking about cultural preservation, right? So what it means to like care for our history, care for the buildings, the historic buildings that we call home, right? That are familiar, that are the very churches, the homes that we live in, the schools that we um, learn from, have it be an educational field site. So each year we have youth that come out to our site from the Caribbean Center for Boys and Girls. And they're from the Christiansted and Frederiksted site that excavate alongside us. And then we also do a lot of environmental work as well that really ties this kind of conversation around our cultural heritage and our environmental heritage together. So has anyone been out to the estate Little Princess? No. Has anyone been out to any of the heritage spaces out here? Any of the former plantations that are on island? Yeah? Do you want to talk about, can you share a bit about those experiences? I know you raised your hand. Mm-hmm. 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 A lot of these spaces haven't been properly cared for, right? So we see a lot of ruins, right, of the sugar mills that are around. Were there any other experiences? You've been to any of these heritage spaces? Yes. Mm-hmm. Exactly, exactly. Women's being looked after by the Landmarks Foundation and is one of the spaces that does have a lot of that restoration work that takes place there. Has anyone else been to any of these historic sites? I know you've worked with the NPS, so I'm sure you've been to some of these spaces. Any other experiences? No? That's fine. So at the Estate Little Princess, we're doing a lot of work in this framework of archaeology of redress. But what's most important about it is that it's a project centered on community um, engagement and really thinking about who needs this history, this work experience the most. So part of our work initially has been to really work with community spaces like Miss Frandell down at Chant, Dr. Chinzira at the University of the Virgin Islands when she was there, and really think about what can people really learn from these spaces and how could it benefit them, right? So part of the maritime work was really introducing students like all of you to the economic access of the scuba diving industry and being able to learn how to swim, how to dive, to actually be a part of the dive industry that's here when you have so many people who don't look like us who are in charge of these industries, right? The other part is trying to give work experience for folks who could then do work with the National Park Service, right? That also provides so many job opportunities for people on island. So down at the Estate Little Princess, and this is a historic image of it, it was a plantation that was founded in 1749, and I promise not to bore you with all of the historical details, but it was 1749 by then Governor Frederick Moss. And it was one of the earliest plantations that was founded just after St. Croix was purchased by the French in 1733. So it's one of the older plantations here on island. And at that particular site, you have the former planter's home, you have the former overseer's home, you have the whole sugar works complex. But the area that my colleagues and I focus on are the enslaved village area that's there. So we're looking at the Black folks who lived and labored at the Estate Little Princess and trying to learn more about their everyday lives, right? So we're actually excavating in and around the homes of where Afro-Crucians lived and labored here. So I have this like neat historic map that shows the former planter's home, the hospital, the overseer's house over here. But what we focus on is this area right here, which at its height in the late 1700s, the estate had accounted for 144 enslaved Afro-Crucians, but it was one of the smaller plantations, right? Zion Farm Plantation at its height had over 300 enslaved Africans that lived there. So we're talking about homes that held really large but vibrant communities, right? So oftentimes what I like to share about in these village areas especially is that while we don't get, see if I can hop to this image. While talking about slavery sometimes can feel really hard, like what could people have possibly done that's like worthwhile during that time? What I like to focus on, at least for our work, are these people, right? So these are images from the late 1800s, early 1900s of Afro-Crucians who lived and labored at the estate Little Princess, right? And I think about these people whenever I go out at that site who forged families together, married one another, had children, right? Who dress their bodies daily. Look, come on. You tell me you don't see that top hat and he looks good, right? Standing tall, right? So thinking about the ways in which people lived their lives, even under the most dire of circumstances, right? The beads, the buttons, we've recovered jewelry fragments from this particular site, thinking about how people adorned their bodies even during this time. And then we also get to see the plates that they ate off of, the glasses that they drank from, these objects that seem very commonplace, but also allow us to see the fullness of their lives, right? Which I don't think we often get a chance to witness when we read about enslavement in our history books. But you guys can let me know what you think about that. Do you get to hear about or read about the kind of expansive experiences that Black folks lived during and under enslavement in your history books, your classes? It's hard. Most of the documents sometimes don't provide that to us, right? But archaeology, because we have the actual material remains of their lives, allow us to. So I get to touch these little fragments of history all the time. Now, usually I talk about all of the sort of archaeological work that we did there, and I can go into these different um, deeper discussions, but I will show this particular video here that shows us two of the structures that were at the estate. So these domestic spaces that we're looking at, I told you it housed over 144 enslaved Africans. Those buildings used to be 6 by 3 meter duplexes. So they're small spaces, right? And you're thinking about maybe 20 of them at the site that slept and housed over 144 people. Where do you think people did most of their activities in that village area? Outside, exactly. And what kind of activities do you think they would have been doing outside? Say that? Of course, right? So they're planting their own gardens, provision gardens, right? To make sure that regardless of the food sources, that they had food for their families, right? So they were growing their own goods, definitely. We've seen a lot of like conch as well on the site. So we know that they were going out and they were fishing. They were making sure that they had what little food was available, that they had food. We know that they were cooking outside at these spaces as well, right? Any sort of craft production that took place, if they were making pottery, for instance, it would have been outside. If they were crafting and making beads or buttons, where we know that that has often taken place on island, that would have also been outside. Spaces of leisure, smoking your tobacco, right? Drinking, that also would have taken place outside. So much of our archaeological work, and you can see in these two excavation units, which are these test pits that we take down in very slow increments that we're able to see change over time under the ground beneath us, is looking at these questions of what people did in the in-between spaces of their homes, right? And then we also got a chance this last year to look at some of the work from inside of their homes. I'm going to speed through some of this because I think this is really exciting. So if you can imagine, oh, mm, mm, here we go. Last year, we got to excavate inside one of the homes that's at the estate Little Princess. And if this is a doorway in front of me, we put a hole in front of the doorway and we put a hole behind the doorway so that we could see what is happening in terms of the building construction outside the home versus inside the home, right? And what we found is that right here, which is where the actual doorway of this structure was, that when it was built, someone buried a horseshoe right in the center of that doorway. Does anyone know like the kind of symbolism that a horseshoe has? What is it? Exactly. Exactly. And these understandings of these sacred metal objects that keep evil out of our homes, that was something that was used back in the 1800s, mid 1800s, when these were built. And we get to see that, right? And from work with like historians like George Tyson here on island, we know that a lot of the Afro-Crucians who lived in this space were baptized, they were Moravians, and they also had their own spiritual understandings around protection, right? They built these homes that they knew they were going to live in, and they did a lot to protect them as well. And we get to see that archaeologically. And outside of that, we get to see a lot of other really amazing finds, such as I mentioned beads and buckles. So we have a lot of bone buttons, so buttons that were made out of animal bone at that site. We have a lot of shell buttons that were made at the site and on island as well. And then we have so many smoking pipes. So there's a lot of tobacco consumption, which I'm never going to be a proponent for smoking cigarettes, but I will say it is something to think about the kind of leisurely activities that were taking place at this site to once again think about the fullness of Black life, right? And then we had jewelry as well. So I'm looking at these really beautiful blue beads that were recovered from the site as well. And just like the horseshoe that has different spiritual symbolism attached to it, blue beads oftentimes can hold a similar understanding of spiritual protection too. So it's been really exciting to be able to see these very small fragments share with us these larger histories at this particular site. So that's what I have to share with y'all today. And I'm here to answer any questions that you have for me about the work that I do, archaeology more broadly. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Anybody want to share any ask any question or share any concerns you may have?
Mm, it's such a good question. So I had a mother who was a single mother. And when I lived in Washington, D.C., there weren't many things to do that were free, but going to the museum was free. So my mother would take me to the museum almost every weekend. And I was the person that'd be like reading a display board and then moving and reading a display. Like I could take hours in a museum. And part of it was just a real love for history, right? So then when I went to college, I was what they call an exploratory major, which means I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was here, right? And it was fine for what it was, but I was like, what am I going to do? I was entering like my second year in college, and I was like, I don't know. And I did journalism because I thought maybe I could write like for the New York Times. And I tried psychology because my mom is a therapist, and I was like, maybe I could be like a psychologist. I don't really like that either. But then I took a class called the Archaeology of African American Life and Culture. Random. I was like, oh, I'll try it. And I really fell in love. And part of it was that I made this connection that as an archaeologist, I could be the person that helps put the objects in the museum. And I loved that so much. So when I did my first archaeology class, I loved it so much. I was like, okay, I think I can do this, you know? And that felt really good. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Can you also, I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you also inform the designation of St. Croix or the Virgin Islands, specifically St. Croix, our new heritage status?
Yeah.
Because we are.
Exactly. So, this new federal designation as a national heritage landscape means that the US government has decided rightfully that there is so much rich history here on St. Croix. And this designation is for living landscapes, right? The kind of understanding that history happened in the past, but it lives on today, right? It lives in all of us that are here in this library space. It lives on in the very buildings that we pass by each day, that we call our churches and our schools. And it also means that there's a call now to care for it, right? To really be in charge of the preservation of this history, right? So while the call is really exciting because it acknowledges the importance of that history, now it's the time to really think about, okay, what does it look like to really care for the history of this island, right? What does it look like to really document the stories from your grandmothers and your great aunts and make sure that they live on, right? To take care of the churches, the historic churches here, the historic school sites here, right? Like St. Croix, I will say one of the most interesting aspects of history is that public education, for all of its complexities, has a deep and rich history into the 1700s here, right? Where enslaved Africans were being taught how to read and write, which is not something that you see in other Caribbean contexts, and certainly not something that was promoted in the continental United States throughout the 1700s or 1800s when there were so many laws and legislation around not teaching, forbidding teaching Black people how to read and write, right? But St. Croix, through the Moravians mainly, had a rich history of educating um, Black populations here. So, yeah, I hope that answered your question. But yeah, are there any other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, like, is this career path like the type of career path you have to have like an emotional detachment from? Like when you go to a site and you find something that may have like an emotional trigger on you, like is this the type of job you need to attach yourself to be?
Yeah, I actually think that our emotional attachment is what's of value in this field. And I think it could be hard because it can be hard to go into these spaces and read about, know about the really hard realities, right? That Afro-Crucians lived and labored here. And it could be hard, to sit with that, the heaviness of the emotion that comes. But it's within that emotional charge that's like, oh, I have to do right by these people, right? I have to do right by my ancestors here, right? So I like to think of that emotional charge and attachment as a positive in this space. It really gives me a drive and a purpose for why I do this work. And each year, we have Dr. Chenzira come out and do a libation ceremony. Do people know what a libation ceremony is? It's a ceremony to honor the indigenous as well as our Black ancestors who lived and labored on this land. And we ask them, right? We ask them for permission to do this work, right? To actually break ground beneath us and for that history to be shared with us with this understanding that it's not just us doing the work, right? That there are so many people who make this work possible. But I think the emotional charge is important. I think it's important. Yeah, that's a really great question. Yes, Ms. Lynch. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to go back to this video. I'm not in this video, but I like how it looks. um, so my first time diving at a wreck site that was involved in bringing enslaved Africans from the continent to the United States was in May of 2022. So it's just under a year. And I was able to work on the Clotilda site. And the Clotilda is the last known vessel to have brought enslaved Africans from the continent to the United States. And there's a real reverence for doing this kind of work because we know that these shipwrecks hold these very expansive histories. And it was also a hard space, right? So I ready myself and prepare myself by like putting on my wetsuit, my dive gear, my mask, and really being thankful for the opportunity to have been invited to do this work, right? To have been invited to this part of history making. But it's so rich of an experience because the Clotilda itself is attached to this vibrant community in Mobile, Alabama, that can actually tie their ancestry back to that particular ship. And that is nothing that I can do with my own direct ancestors, right? I know that we were in Texas like up until 1852, but that's about as far back as I can go. And for many of us, especially for the historians and people and local historians, especially within our families, it could be really hard to trace your ancestry back beyond, the early 1800s. Maybe we can get to a vessel. You're really lucky if you can. Maybe you can make it to a ship's ledger from the continent of Africa. Those are really rare experiences. But for the descendants of the folks who came on the Clotilda, they get to have that experience. And being a part of that allowed me, I think, to also wrestle with what that means in my own family and legacy. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yes, of course. Are there any other questions?
Um, as far as I know, not being a parent so far, just for children in general, or if you were to one day have your own children,
Yeah.
what would be your directives
Yeah.
in terms of them learning and analyzing history? Like, what would be your admonitions for them? Because I think I want to add another voice to the choir, trying to get young people on a path of self-education
Yeah.
when maybe they are in spaces and places where they're not adequately provided for. So
Mm-hmm.
what words of advice would you give young people about knowing their
Yeah.
history?
I mean, I think my word of advice would be ask all the questions, right? Like when you are in these educational spaces, you get to ask questions. It's like one of the times where it's like, no, please, like ask me the question. Question what's being taught to you. Ask what this means for you and your history. Like, I feel like oftentimes we might not be provided with that in our classroom sessions, but you get to ask, right? And there's so much history on St. Croix, right? It's beneath us, but it's also, you can see it when you're walking down Frederickstead, Christiansted, you see these historic buildings, right? You get to ask questions about that. There is a lot of work, historical work that's been done on the history of this space. And even though I know you're not all going to become archaeologists, right? But part of this is understanding that whether you go into the field of law, right? If you go into the field of medicine, if you go into the field of business, that having a rooted understanding of yourself and a rooted understanding of your history allows you to really stand up in these career fields, right? To be empowered in these career fields, to make decisions about the kind of future that you want for yourself. And if you decide to have children, for your children as well, that's really rooted in an understanding of the importance of your history and heritage, right? That you lay claim here and you know what's here when you do that. So yeah. It was still trying to connect. Are there any other questions or thoughts? I didn't put you to sleep. Thank you. No other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all.
Work on your document. You've been working on it. So if you were to describe a